In this episode of Second Sex, we explore Chapter 9 of the Situation section, from Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, pages 702, 793 in most editions, where she turns her attention to the often overlooked experience of women transitioning from maturity to old age. The central question we're tackling today is really, based on the constraints of their female functions, what does de Beauvoir reveal about the unique societal and personal challenges women face as they move from maturity into old age?
Yeah, it's a fascinating and often quite challenging section.
Definitely. We'll be drawing directly from de Beauvoir's work here to really understand the specific crises and transformations she identifies in this pivotal yet often underexplored stage of a woman's life.
Let's dive right in then. De Beauvoir kicks things off by highlighting a key difference, she argues, in how men and women experience aging, particularly around menopause.
Right.
What's really striking is her idea that, unlike the often more gradual aging process for men, women face these more sudden, decisive turning points. Menopause is the big one she points to.
And she calls it quite brusque, doesn't she? This removal of what society, and often women themselves, see as core parts of femininity.
Exactly. Sexual allure, the ability to reproduce, things society has historically placed immense value on for women.
And it's not just biological, is it? That's what she stresses. It's the meaning attached.
Precisely. Because their self-worth, their perceived path to happiness, has been so tangled up with these attributes.
So you get this paradox she describes.
Yeah.
A woman might still be chronologically, relatively young, maybe only middle age,
With half her adult life potentially still ahead.
but she feels like her future's been sort of cut off, that a vital part is just gone.
Absolutely. And that leads into her point about identity. A woman's identity and her societal value have been so tied to reproduction that losing that capacity can spark a really deep existential crisis.
So this dangerous age, as it's sometimes called, it's about more than just the physical stuff.
Much more. She acknowledges the physical changes, of course, the organic troubles, but argues their real significance lies in their symbolic weight, how they're interpreted.
By the woman herself and by everyone around her.
Yes. The core crisis, she suggests, isn't necessarily the body failing, but the anxious consciousness surrounding it, the way we think and worry about these changes.
That makes a lot of sense. The narrative shifts.
Right. And it's interesting, she notes this isn't a universal experience for all women.
How so?
Well, women who've built identities beyond just traditional femininity through work, for instance, inside or outside the home, they might actually feel a sense of relief when menstruation ends.
Oh, liberation from the burden, in a way.
Exactly. And she mentions peasant women or workers' wives, for whom the end of the constant threat of pregnancy could be genuinely welcomed. It brings a different kind of freedom.
So context is everything. It shows how social structures shape even these biological events.
Absolutely. The difficulties, she argues, often stem less from the biology itself and more from the psychological and social interpretations. The emotional drama can start before the physical changes and last long after.
Then she draws that sharp contrast with men's aging.
Yeah, she argues that mature men are usually involved in other things, deriving worth from their work, their projects.
Their status isn't primarily tied to being an object of desire in the same way.
Right. So changes in their appearance, while maybe noted, don't necessarily undermine their power of seduction or social standing in the same fundamental way.
But for women.
Well, de Beauvoir points out that women often reach their sexual peak, in terms of societal perception at least, maybe around 35.
Just when their own desires might be strongest.
Exactly. And historically, they've often had to rely heavily on those sexual attributes to please, to gain security, often through men.
So the central anxiety becomes, what happens when that hold on a man weakens, that perceived powerlessness?
She uses that striking phrase, witnessing the degradation of this object of flesh, the aging female body.
And all the efforts to fight it. The cosmetics, the procedures.
She sees them as ultimately futile against this inevitable, irreversible process. For women whose identity is so tied to the physical, it can feel almost like facing death itself.
Now here's a point that kind of surprised me. About narcissistic women.
Yes. You'd think they'd be the most devastated by aging, right?
Right. But she suggests maybe not.
Her argument is that women who've always focused intensely on their beauty might actually adapt more readily because they've likely always been aware of aging, maybe even anticipated it, strategized around it.
Interesting. So who struggles most? according to her?
It's often the women who've lived lives of forgetfulness, devotion, and self-sacrifice, the ones who lived for others.
Why them specifically?
Because they suddenly confront themselves in a new way. Their past life devoted to husband, children, whatever, suddenly feels narrow, maybe disappointing.
Like they wake up and feel cheated or misunderstood.
Precisely. Like the role they played is ending, and they're left asking, what about me? And like adolescents facing an uncertain future, they might deny the reality of aging initially.
Clinging to some idea of inner potential, feeling like life passed them by.
Yeah, and this sense of loss can lead to various coping mechanisms. Like adolescents struggling with mortality, they find it hard to accept finitude.
Trying to compensate for a perceived poverty of existence.
Right, holding on to vague ideas of inner worth, hidden talents. They might withdraw, keep diaries, ruminate on regrets.
Constructing beautiful retrospective romances, as she puts it, almost rewriting their past.
Yes, she gives that example from Helen Deutsch, the woman idealizing her unhappy first marriage years into a happy second one. It's about finding a different narrative.
And then there were the more active attempts to, stop time?
Exactly. Maternal women wanting more children, sensual women seeking new lovers, coquettes trying even harder to please, often insisting they feel younger than they are.
But she sees these not as real fresh starts, necessarily.
More like symbolic compensation for the past, she argues. Finally trying to do the things they felt they missed, learning piano, sculpting, traveling, fulfilling suppressed desires.
And relationships change too, right? Marital ones.
Significantly, she notes possibilities like increased frigidity, maybe out of resentment, or conversely, overwhelming demands for affection. Sometimes a return to masturbation or even latent homosexual feelings surfacing. She mentions a case, Mrs. X.
And this seeking of adventure. Mrs. BZ and her daughter's lover. Complex situations.
It seems like a pushing against old constraints, but even if not acted upon, de Beauvoir points out that intense fantasies can surface.
Things considered taboo.
Yeah, incestuous thoughts, attraction to prostitution, things that can cause real anxiety and lead to behavior that seems bizarre, reflecting this inner turmoil. The line between imagination and reality can blur.
More so than in puberty, she suggests.
Yes, and she identifies this key characteristic. Depersonalization.
That feeling of losing yourself, right? Not recognizing the person in the mirror.
Exactly, that quote. I am not the old woman the mirror shows me. It's a profound disconnect.
A kind of alienation from your own body, your own past self.
And this inability to reconcile the younger self with the older one can lead to reality feeling less solid, more reliance on internal feelings.
Making them more susceptible to intense states, ecstasies, visions.
Potentially.
Yeah.
And she notes a higher incidence of erotomania, the delusion of being loved in women around this age, 40 to 50. It reflects that ongoing preoccupation with love and connection.
And for some, if human love feels lost, they turn elsewhere.
To religion, yes. She observes that former flirts, or women who lived more worldly lives, might become very pious around menopause.
Why? What does religion offer them in her view?
It provides a framework, a narrative for those feelings of being misunderstood, of a wasted life. These can be reframed as trials from God.
A way to make sense of the disappointment.
Right. But she also warns this can make them vulnerable to spiritual guides, sects, faith healers, even charlatans. Their critical sense might be weakened, and they're desperately searching for some definitive truth.
So the menopause crisis might create this illusion of a new life, a conversion.
But reality often bites back, leading to depression when the illusion fades. The underlying anxiety returns.
That feeling that life is already finished.
Yes. And instead of fighting despair, some embrace it, rehashing grievances, imagining plots against them.
Morbid jealousy towards the husband can intensify too.
Very much so, she notes. Friends, sisters, his job, perceived rivals. Pathological cases apparently peak between 50 and 55.
So what happens if a woman doesn't accept aging? If she keeps relying on her charms?
De Beauvoir argues the marriage often becomes inadequate then. The woman's own desires might be awakening just as the husband is settling down, becoming resigned.
Leading to that desire to live her life, maybe seek lovers.
Yes, often with fewer scruples, she suggests. It can become a kind of manhunt, using various strategies, charm, manipulation, feigned vulnerability.
And attraction to younger men sometimes.
That can stem from wanting disinterested tenderness or maybe a feeling of dominance they lacked before. Cynicism can emerge too, feeling it's their turn, maybe using money for erotic freedom.
The mistress benefactress trying to buy affection.
Which often ends badly, devolving into exploitation. Prudence, de Beauvoir suggests, dictates disarming, accepting aging before passions fade completely to avoid more pain.
But what happens when a woman accepts aging? The situation changes then.
It does. She becomes, as de Beauvoir puts it, asexual but complete, an elderly woman. The main crisis might seem over, but a new struggle begins. Keeping a place on Earth, maintaining relevance, finding purpose.
They might use age as an excuse, though, to avoid chores, assert independence.
Yes, there can be that. A disdain for fashion, social niceties,
Yeah.
a kind of liberation.
But then the children leave.
And they find freedom just when they feel they have nothing more to do with it. That's the rub.
Because patriarchal society made their functions servile, freedom comes with losing productivity.
Exactly. At 50 or so, when men might be at their peak power, women are often pushed into retirement, feeling useless after a lifetime of devotion,
A really profound sense of being unneeded.
which can lead to desperate attempts to cling to loved ones. Maybe the husband, but routines are set, he might not perceive the need.
So they turn to the children, especially sons.
Often, yes. Hoping to live through them, find satisfaction there. Idealizing the son, the relationship. Sometimes with those incestuous undertones, usually just fantasy, but still.
But it gets complicated. Rigid expectations.
Very. Difficulty respecting the son's freedom, conflict between wanting his success and fearing for him, lack of real collaboration prevents genuine complicity.
Even pride in his success doesn't fully satisfy her.
Apparently not. And then the daughter-in-law arrives.
Often met with hostility. Seen as stealing the son.
Yes, disrupting the mother's perceived necessary role, leading to criticism, undermining.
And relationships with daughters or granddaughters can be tricky too. Ambivalent.
Hostility, seeing the daughter as a rival, denying her motherhood, or over-identifying, trying to relive youth through her. Grandmothers might transfer hostility to grandkids or become overly possessive.
What about women without children? Do they seek substitutes?
Yes, trying to create artificial bonds, maternal tenderness towards younger people, becoming mentors, teachers, spiritual guides, trying to reincarnate themselves in protégés.
But the same problems can arise.
Often, yes. Similar conflicts. De Beauvoir concludes women rarely find true justification in posterity. They either cling too tight and get disappointed, or resign themselves to limited participation, feeling regret and ennui.
Which brings us back to that core tragedy of uselessness.
Yes. The derisory problem, she calls it, of how to kill time, masked by things like women's handiwork, activities lacking real purpose or joy.
Social life becomes huge then. Events, gossip.
A primary outlet, yeah. Compensating for inaction. Even charity work can become self-serving, focused on the organization itself, not the aims.
Because they lack real societal hold, practical understanding, their morality becomes negative, prohibitive.
That's her argument. Even if committed to a cause, they often lack autonomous production, just seeking to keep busy.
Like adolescents without direction, asking, what's the use?
But unlike young men, they often lack the hope or drive to find new goals. So they retreat into routine, religion, becoming stoic or brittle.
But there's another possibility. Serenity.
Yes, for some, when they give up the fight, accept death. And if the husband declines first, it can even feel like a kind of revenge. Widowhood might be born cheerfully.
Why cheerfully?
Because women, especially in old age, often profit less from marriage, particularly if the husband becomes a burden. They might gain independence, see through past illusions, developing that delicious cynicism.
Exactly. Women who have lived, she says, gain unique knowledge of people behind the scenes.
But their wisdom often remains negative. Contestation, refusal, ultimately sterile.
Yes. The woman parasite, reliant on others, never achieves both effectiveness and independence. That's her rather stark conclusion for that type.
And she ends with that really disturbing case, Madame Lefebvre.
Right, the woman who killed her pregnant daughter-in-law. An extreme example, obviously.
But she uses it to illustrate the potential depth of that psychological turmoil, that desperate, violent clinging to the maternal role when it feels threatened long after menopause.
Her lack of remorse, the distorted justifications, it's chilling. Highlights the power of those unresolved pressures.
And her delusion of being pregnant herself underscores how central motherhood was to her very identity.
So wrapping this up, the central insight here is really how de Beauvoir shows societal expectations around femininity and biology profoundly shaping women's aging.
Marked by these crises, the struggle for meaning beyond those traditional, often limiting roles.
The real aha moment, for me anyway, is seeing how clearly she argues these challenges aren't just biological destiny.
Right. They're so deeply tied to social structures, the limited pathways historically available to women. That's crucial.
Definitely. And maybe a final provocative thought for you, the listener. Thinking about these observations from, what, the mid-20th century, how much do they still ring true today?
Yeah, what's really changed in how society sees women aging and what hasn't?
Are there new kinds of traps, or perhaps more hopefully new freedoms that exist now in this stage of life?
It's certainly something complex and still evolving to really ponder.